Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing this evening? We believe that the Zoom servers are down. Again, as I think we said in the first week, things seem to be an awful lot simpler back in the world of reliable heliographs and flag whappers and all that sort of stuff. So we're just going to crack on, and you can take a little look at this sort of ex post facto sort of thing. We're going to be having a little look at the Battle of Arras this evening, or Arras or Arras, it depends how you like to pronounce this one. An interesting battle from 1917, which has been, for various reasons, rather much sort of forgotten in the British consciousness and psyche. It seems perhaps overwhelmed and overshadowed by what perhaps is commonly referred to as Passchendaele, the Third Ypres campaign there. So let's think about this battle from April and May 1917. Perhaps, Jim, you want to jump in on this one. Why was the Battle of Arras fought? Because this isn't what you might really call sort of like traditional BEF territory, is it? What had the French been doing in the Arras sector before the BEF arrived, and why did the British find themselves here launching an offensive in 1917?
Yeah, so as we kind of talked about a few episodes back with the Battle of Loos, the area around Arras was not traditionally really British territory. What happened was the British slowly moved farther south, taking over territory like this from the French. Obviously, the French have been fighting at such notable sites that would later be important for the BEF, Vimy Ridge, areas like that, as the French army moved farther south in response to the Battle of Verdun. Verdun took up so much power out of the French army. About 90% of all French soldiers who served in the First World War spend some time at Verdun. There's the need for the British to take over more and more space as the British army is growing its presence and the French army is shrinking theirs. So now, for the first time in 1917, the British are going to be the main power on the Western Front because the French have been simply bled dry. Now, the French, while this attack's going to go in starting on the 9th of April, the French are going to also make attacks further south, culminating in their Chemin de Dam offensive, which fails absolutely massively. So so this is really the southernmost push the British have ever had done. And again, just like many Allied offensives on the Western Front, it's meant to be done in conjunction with the French, but not, as we would later see, under one central command, which is something that'll pop up in 1918.
Is this really why then we see what you might call sort of like a geographical split in what the BEF are doing in 1917? Because of course we've got two main offensives in the Ypres salient, obviously sort of like the Messines Ridge attacks, and then further up towards the Third Ypres offensive, the Passchendaele offensive, for the want of a better word. We see the attacks going in at Arras, and we also see the attacks very much the tail end of the year at the Battle of Cambrai. Is that why there was this geographical split? Because the BEF was being pulled in one direction to assist the French, and also wanting to carry on with its own strategic objectives.
Yeah, so this is a perfect example of the political military divide at the heart of British leadership during the First World War. There's a constant need, especially on the political side, to support the Allies, whether that be support the French directly on the Western Front, or support other allies, whether it be in the Salonika theater or in the Middle East. But Haig and BEF immediate command are always really pushy to get an offensive going in Flanders, which we'll see starting in June with Messines Ridge, and then later through the end of 1917 around the Ypres salient, with the idea as well of hitting the German sub-bases and naval ports on the North Sea to help protect British shipping a little more, and also simply to bleed the German army white. This is really another one of those compromises of Haig's willing to commit to this so long as he's got the backing and support of everybody back in the UK, as well as of his French allies. Ultimately, obviously, the French are going to get really bogged down, which is going to result in, for the first time in the First World War, a British-only operation, which will come later in the year, that being Messines Ridge and the ensuing Third Battle of Ypres.
Fabulous stuff. So let's have a little think now about the shape of the battle in outline. What were the various stages that this offensive went through, and were they a success?
Yeah, so I'll take this too. The Battle of Arras is really split into several phases. I know John Duncan, who's joining us for the first time,
Yeah.
has John Smithson's
Mr.
book on the first phase, on the first Battle of the Scarp,
Yeah.
which is an amazing book, and of course we'll send links to be able to purchase all the books we mentioned after this. But so the first battle is probably the most famous part of the Battle of Arras, because you've got the Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge, which is also supported by 2 British divisions and the 51st Highland Division, which is immediate south of the Canadians. But this also includes fighting around towns like Monchy, which is going to be fought over very heavily, and pushes that will lead into the second Battle of the Scarp and fighting around the chemical works at Roux. And fighting around the Point de Jour. So really that first week of the Battle of Arras is probably the most famous one, but just like other battles in the middle period of the First World War, it's going to be fought in these several stages, right? We call this all the Battle of Arras, just like we would refer to the Battle of the Somme as the Battle of the Somme, but in reality it was several different phases that lasted months or weeks, whether it be the fighting around Beaumont-Hamel, both in July, then November. You have fighting in the same areas at Arras from April then into the end of May, before the British Army switches its attention further north. So it's, again, one of these slow but simultaneous pushes. It's going to see the Germans use their first form of elastic defense, where they're actually going to let the Allies get into the first and possibly even the second line trench, expecting them to do so, and then hit them when they're very tired with what they call engreiff divisions or counterattack divisions. So this is going to be sort of a new form of warfare, but also somewhat old, as it's still trench warfare, some fighting over open ground, but at least in the defensive tactics that Germans are using, you're starting to see adaptations in the way that they're fighting.
That's great. So obviously, the battle here is very famous for the Canadian chaps finally capturing the heights of Vimy Ridge. Obviously, you know, with the French army that you mentioned there before, there's the Chemin des Dames offensive there, you know, which was led by General Nivelle. Why did that fail so badly when the remainder of the British and Canadian operations would be what you might call a qualified success? What went so badly wrong for them there?
I think one of the major things is that after the Battle of Verdun, General Nivelle comes out really as a hero of the French army, someone who is willing to take ground, someone who knows how to beat the Germans. So over the winter of 1916-1917, the French have these high, insane hopes. And Nivelle's making these promises, right, that you will hear throughout the First World War. But to the average poilu, the average French soldier, this is awesome, right? They're going to break through these German lines. This is going to be the end. They've never seen this much munition, this much equipment coming up. So they're ready for this to just pulverize the German positions in an area that had been fought over since the Battle of the Marne, really, in 1914. So when the attacks start and they're met with immediate heavy resistance, but the French command structure is unwilling to deviate from the plan and keeps on launching men and material at the same hard points that are unable to break through, that's where it really starts to break down. And the unwillingness to deviate from the plan, the absolutely horrific condition that the French soldier is experiencing, not only the actual combat conditions, but the living conditions. Throughout the majority of the First World War, the French soldier probably has it worse than any other soldier on the Western Front in terms of leave, in terms of that sort of support network to keep him mentally and morally.
Yeah, letters, pay, you know, canteens behind the line, that sort of stuff.
And that all really comes to a head in the spring of 1917, early summer, with the French Army mutinies, which surprisingly the Germans don't take advantage of.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
It's one of the greatest. It's one of the greatest secrets kept of the First World War. Is the Germans really don't know what's going on. But because of that, that's why you're going to see the growing emphasis on the British forces, and by the end of 1917, beginning of 1918, the growing presence of the American forces in France.
So one of the good things that was commemorated in Scotland a few years back in 2017 was the idea of Arras as a Scottish battle, because of course there was the 9th Division, the 15th Division, the 51st Highland Division that we've touched on. There were obviously a lot of Canadian Scottish troops, South African Scottish chaps there as well. So the whole thing here is, was the Battle of Arras actually a Scottish battle? Does it deserve that name? Because surely if it was a Scottish battle, then there would be something akin to the Vimy Memorial. Why is that not, what's been the disconnect here, sort of thing? What was this a Scottish battle? Was there still the large amounts of sort of like local casualties that you found maybe earlier on in the war? This is perhaps something John Duncan of New Battle of War, who's joining us today, might be able to help us out on a little bit. So what do we think, fellas?
Yeah, it was a very large involvement of Scottish battalions in the Battle of Arras. It was about 50 battalions, which is a phenomenal amount. It was the largest collection of Scottish soldiers on the field since the Battle of Flodden in the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. So that gives you an idea. As well as the divisions you mentioned, you've got the 34 Division, you've got the 15th and 16th Royal Scots, and in 4 Division you've got the 2nd Sea Force, a regular battalion.
Yeah, and, often forgotten these chaps as well. In the non-Scottish, but the non-Scots divisions. There's a lot of Scottish battalions just get airbrushed out of history, don't they? And good battalions too that you just mentioned there. Very, 1st and 2nd Edinburgh, great.
Yeah, these county battalions are a mixture from units all over the United Kingdom. 34 divisions at the Tyneside Scottish, Tyneside Irish, as well, and the Lincolns and the Suffolks. So it's a composite division, but it was a phenomenal amount of troops involved from Scotland. And I know from a local perspective, from like the Edinburgh Midlothian area, Arras, the casualties sustained there are second only to the Battle of Loos. Everybody associates the Somme with the greatest cost to the British Army, but from a Scottish perspective, the Arras is second only to Loos. Loos was for many of the new army battalions were blooded and it suffered extremely heavily. Arras is not far behind that, and the casualty rate at Arras is one of the highest in the entire war. It's over 8,000 a day, and it was which is probably the reason the battle was relatively short compared to others in the Great War, because it was unsustainable.
Purely unsustainable from that point of view, obviously, John, you've done a lot of sort of like local research and that sort of stuff. Have you got anything sort of like specifically from Edinburgh and the Lothians that you'd be able to share with us? I'm thinking maybe maybe some stuff on the attacks on the chemical works, or the comical works as it was known, obviously, which would be taking place 103 years ago, more or less now.
That's good. Well, really, the lead up to the chemical works stems from the opening day of the battle, when 4th Division pushed through a remarkable distance from Arras through to the village of Fompou, which is about a couple of kilometres from Roux. When they got there, it was almost unopposed, but so when they got to the Hyderabad Redoubt, which is one of the main German defences, they called for cavalry to exploit this gap. Unfortunately, the weather was very poor indeed. It was very unseasonable. Now the weather was beautiful, but on the opening day of the battle, there's a howling gale blowing, there's intermittent blizzards, and the ground has been cut up very badly by artillery. This meant as well that they couldn't move artillery up to support any further attacks. 4th Division sensibly stopped, because if they went any further, they were completely out with artillery cover. But that was a missed opportunity, because they could almost Rooks that day was almost not undefended, but very lightly defended, and in all probability it would have fallen if it had attacked. They held off, as I say, understandably, and by the following morning the Germans had heavily reinforced the chemical works of Rooks, which isn't actually a chemical works as such. It was actually a sugar factory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it strikes me in some respects like there's almost aspects of the opening phases of the Gallipoli campaign. If we go back to next week, you know, there's a lot of what ifs on, you know, on the opening day of the campaign there. And had they been able to do this, had they been able to do that, then who knows what else there, yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly a missed opportunity. But hindsight's a wonderful thing, really, because
that's the whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah. But this meant, though, that the attack on Rooks was put back to the 11th of April, 2 days after the battle, by which time the troops there have been out in the open for like two to 3 nights in freezing cold conditions. And the attack over what is, I can tell you, it's pretty open ground there. There's not much cover. There's a Greenland Hill was, in Scottish terms, it's not a hill. It's a
Yeah.
you'll struggle to find the summit. In fact, really. But,
that's one of the things that struck me the first time that I saw it. I was just like, that's it, is it? Right. You know, you're standing there like rechecking the map a wee bit. It's almost a bit like, just going back to Gallipoli, looking at Ashley Barber and just thinking, that's not as big as Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh, and that's what caused the trouble, right?
No, it's not like it. Yeah. But it meant really as well that the road conditions, it was difficult to move any artillery of any note up to support the attack. And the battalion ward of the 2nd Sea Force, it records that the artillery barrage was very poor indeed, with hardly any shells seemed to land in or around the chemical works. And the attack went ahead in very poor weather conditions. The Highlanders were silhouetted against the snow. They haven't got any snow camouflage, they've got their khaki. And they stuck out literally like sore thumbs. And they were mown down in massive numbers. The battalion suffered 92% casualties. Every single officer involved in the attack was either killed or wounded or missing.
And I take it these are sort of like the later war battalion numbers. You know, we used in 1915 to like 1,000 men going in. I presume by 1917 we're looking 600, 700, something like that, maybe. Yeah,
and despite the fact that it's nominally a regular battalion, by 1917 it have very few the post-war regulars in the 2nd Sea Force. That's just a nominal idea, that really. But, one of the officers there was a Donald McIntosh from Glasgow and Edinburgh. His family, he went to Fettes College in Edinburgh, and he was leading his men forward. He was tasked with taking the railway station, and in the advance there, he was wounded twice and continued to lead on his men, and he rose a 3rd time to urge his men on. And as that happened, he was shot and fatally wounded a 3rd time, and he was actually awarded the Victoria Cross. And he's one of the more fortunate ones in that he has a known grave. He's buried in the Brownscop Cemetery just outside, right on the edges of Fonpool. Anybody else wants to come here?
Oh no, I think that was going back to what you asked Dave about monuments. That's actually, John beat me to the gun. I mean, there's not one giant monument like the Canadians have with, you know, this is Canada's coming of age moment. They're not a nation that has a clear, let's say, somewhat militaristic or violent separation from the United Kingdom as other countries might have. Not naming names here, not saying names or anything. But I think the thing that interests me about memorialization at Arras is Scotland does have a large amount of memorialization, but it's not centralized. Whereas like at the Somme, you have the huge Highland Division Memorial at Beaumont Hamel. I'm always really taken aback by the 2nd Sea Force Memorial, which is a Celtic cross at Fampoux. And then I was going to mention the Victoria Cross winner in front of Fettes, which I don't generally want to mention Fettes, but I mean, that is a clear memorial to someone who was killed at Arras. And has deep connections to Glasgow, and Glasgow University claims him as well as, even though he never actually attended. His father, for those who are in Glasgow, the major medical center in Hillhead, Partick was opened and was his father was a doctor there. So there are clear connections everywhere, as well as the Pointe de Jour Memorial to the 9th Division, which is one of my favorite memorials on the Western Front. It's a big cairn with each of the regiments that supplied units to the division, including the South Africans. So I think there's some really interesting memorialization outside of one big central tall monument. Yeah.
The 9th Division Memorial you mentioned there, it was removed. It was sort of moved from its original location. It actually sat in between the motorway. It was almost impossible to get to. Take your life in your hands, a bit like the 9th Division when they moved it.
A bit like they did, God bless them.
Yeah, but they moved it to the Pointe de Jour Ridge next to the cemetery there, which is a much better location now. But the failure of that attack by 4th Division then meant that another division had to be pitched in to attack the chemical works. And unfortunately for 9th Scottish Division, it was them. And all this, as Jim mentioned, the South Africans were part of that division, including the South African Scottish, who, although they say South African Scottish, a lot of them actually came from the Transvaal, and some of them were formerly our enemies, the Boers.
Yeah. It's incredible when you see officer groups, you know, so some of the high-ranking officers that have an interesting mix of silverware, shall we say? All to Britain's credit and great resource, though, that we had, these chaps on our side.
They're a Zulu war veteran in the midst as well. The men for the Transvaal were predominantly Presbyterian, which as the majority probably the 9th Division were as well. The Lowlanders, well, there'll be a mix, obviously. But the 12th of April, it was decided that the 9th Scottish Division would have a go at the chemical works, and it was probably an even bigger disaster than the attack by 4th Division. It was supposed to go in at midday. The weather and the comms were terrible. The artillery is still moving up, because 9th Division artillery have an excellent reputation. They were one of the best, but they said they were struggling to get any meaningful support because we're still moving up. The roads were terrible. The roads were congested, and the weather was continued to be absolutely appalling. The 9th Division had probably by that time, as well as being involved in initial attack, was 4 nights out in the open in sub-zero temperatures. And on the day of the attack, some of the South Africans had to be helped just to literally stand up, lifted up by their comrades, and their kilts were frozen solid, stuck to them. The attack got moved back to 5:30, and that didn't achieve anything really, but they came under extremely heavy shell fire as soon as they emerged from the trenches. And in reality, the majority of them were killed before they'd even reached Brown's Copse, which that's only about 400 or 500 metres from the edge of the village. And that's probably the majority of them that have got a grave are buried. Some of the units did press on, and there was an unconfirmed report for a balloon that kilted soldiers had been spotted in the edges of the chemical works. It was dismissed out of hand. It was thought impossible that any man could have got through there. But a month later, when the chemical works was taken there, they found men from the 4th South African Infantry. They found their bodies exactly where the report said it. So it's quite incredible how they must have been using what very little dead ground there is to get there.
To get up,
But I think
one of the things that really strikes me is just the astonishing intensity of the combat. And as you were saying there, John, sort of like the lack of support that they were getting. One of the chaps, one of my sort of like personal heroes, is a fellow called Lieutenant Kinloch Ogilvie, who was 13th Royal Scots. He was at Daniel Stewart's College, and he actually won a military cross for essentially leaving the British positions whilst, what was the British bombardment was actually taking place, and reconnoitering the German positions with a large roll of white mine tape. And it was essentially paid this back in two across no man's land under a hail of machine gun fire. So when the attack went in, his chaps had sort of like the best opportunity as possible to get forward. And that sort of astonishing intensity that, you know, is quite incredible, really, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, that's something that's always fascinated me, because I've always, as these three will tell you, I've always been fascinated by my favorite division, which is the 15th Scottish Division. And there, the debate, and I've talked to Jim Smithson, the author, about this, of who got into the town of Monchy first. Everybody claims to have gotten in, and we'll bring up graphics of a map of this town when we edit the video, but just the confusion of people entering one objective all at the same time. You have a simultaneous cavalry charge by I believe the Essex Yeomanry against machine guns at the time, that, you know, obviously fails horribly, and there's some great primary sources from that. But just the sheer, just absolute confusion. There's a great account, and I'm sure Rowan can talk more about this, from the 9th Black Watch, which fights over a particularly horrible area that's still visible today, called the Railway Triangle, during their initial attack, where part of the 15th Division actually captures bits of German artillery. That's how far in they push, and they're completely surprised by it. So it's a really interesting battle, that, especially the first phase, that has a mix of really every part of the First World War. You've got tanks, obviously you've got the huge RFC presence around Arras. You've got guys overrunning heavy artillery, which is completely unheard of at a time like the Somme. But then you've got house-to-house fighting. You've got horrible trench fighting. It's a really fascinating point of the battle.
This is all things sort of like this, you know, breaking through into, into the chemical works. This is what you might call almost sort of like urban warfare. I don't suppose that really there'd been a particularly great emphasis on that during training. This is something that they would more or less be just having to pick up as they went along, sort of thing, you know?
Yeah. It's very ad hoc.
Yeah. Go for it, Ron.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to kind of launch into a bit about what training they actually had for this, but
launch away, my friend.
So in terms of urban warfare, obviously not a lot, and the whole bit around the chemical works, you can see from what happened. But Arras is kind of a really interesting point in the war, that because you see there's just complete change in doctrine from between sort of the Somme and then. I don't like to go with the view that at the Somme, you know, there was just people walking into machine guns and stuff, but the tactics were still very much, once you were out of the trench, very similar to 1914, but trying to employ better weapons. As we get to Arras, I'm just going to share some stuff on my screen here. Just a minute. Right, so basically on the left here we have photograph from the 1914 Manual of Infantry Training showing what a platoon looks like when it attacks. On the right we've got one of the many, can you see that now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
one of the many manuals issued in 1917. This one's possibly post-Arras, I can't remember. But it shows basically what's happened. So in 1914, when you go out of a trench or out of a jumping off point, you're effectively in a line, or potentially two lines as illustrated here. Platoon commander out in front, and these are all riflemen. We still technically do that at the Somme, but using bombers and Lewis guns, but only within the battalion. Arras is very much a platoon battle, with lower level commanders making decisions effectively as they see fit at the time, a lot more free rein given. And if this diagram is going to be a bit harder to see, but we have the platoon commander in the middle with an HQ, and at the front we have riflemen, bayonet men, bombers, and at the back Lewis gunners, rifle bombers. So there's a sort of two-wave theory within each platoon. They can also go into a kind of diamond formation with men with rifle and bayonets at the front and everything else sort of behind. And it might not seem like a massive change, but it makes a much better way of employing all these different parts within a platoon rather than within a battalion.
You know, the one thing that I'm just absolutely obsessed with, because I've never seen, in the years of studying the First World War, this is the first time I've seen actually someone put the two diagrams, like two immediately related diagrams together. thing that kind of blows my mind away, just as an amazing change in this short amount of time, is you still have a drummer mentioned in the 1914.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the drummer is effectively replaced by this point by this little box here, which is the platoon HQ, which has 2 runners and a batman in it, basically. Because your drummer is effectively still your signaller and would probably be trained in semaphore and things at that point. But yeah, basically what this allows for is that everything becomes a lot more mobile than it would have been even in 1914. But it really, and it just employs these different weapons together in a much better way. But we've seen from what Jim was saying a minute ago that it can kind of backfire slightly, this this platoon level and company level independence, because you were saying about the railway junction or the railway triangle where the Ninth Black Watch companies got far too far out in front. So there's obviously problems with communication and between attacking forces still. So we're still ironing that out, and I think it really takes until the Third Battle of Ypres to get that. But Arras is, even though it's technically a subsidiary or a diversionary attack, they're very much prepared to push through if they can, and we've talked about there being cavalry involved in this, but obviously this is what's going first. And the other point I would make about this is the only thing that doesn't change between these 2 diagrams is, in all the training notes of these things, is that the ultimate aim of any attack going in is to get close with the bayonet and push all the way through. And that absolutely doesn't change, because there's no other way of breaking an enemy line. There still isn't today. So yeah, it's just a few things to think about in how the battle was actually fought.
Another issue with the troops by 1917 was that their marksmanship had dropped off very, very badly indeed, compared to like the start of the war, when it was excellent. But they were used to get too used to trench warfare, where they're firing at relatively close range. And they get out in open terrain, targets are further away, and a lot of the units their men were unable to actually get fire onto the Germans, because they hadn't been used to firing at greater distances. An interesting point was that at the Arras, there's a firing range, and the 8th Royal Scots, who are a pioneer battalion, that because of that had suffered the same degree of casualties as other units from 1914. And you see their marksmen, their scores and marksmanship compared to some of the other battalions, and it's like night and day. They're putting a lot of fire then onto the target and hitting it, whereas some of the other battalions, like, it's like, woof, it's just like volley fire almost.
Yeah. One of the ways that we actually do see people getting around that is between the first and the second stage of the battle. I actually found a reference to the 6th Black Watch starting to practice for the second phase of the battle on taped out trenches on the ground and practicing going over this, I think, because they'd realised that they could practice all these things while they're on rest in theory, but when they went over for the first phase of the battle, they weren't very good at it, really.
And I think that's a really interesting point, that as we talk, and comparatively, we've talked about the Somme and Loos and Gallipoli. In previous, the average British soldier in 1917, you're starting to see conscripts in this battle. You're seeing, also importantly, even though we focus on Scotland and Scottish units, there's an amazing account, I forget who it is, but Dave and I quote him a lot, from the 9th Royal Scots, talking about the makeup of his section going over the top at Arras.
Bill Hay, incredible man.
And he has some interesting things to say about his squad mates. But I think it's also very interesting to note that we're not talking about, when we say the 9th Royal Scots, they're not all Edinburgh guys anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They're not all Scots anymore. The 4th Sea Force famously had a large contingent of guys, I believe, from Manchester. So there's a really wide divide as we talk about who makes up these troops, and not only in the Scottish battalions. The Canadians, it's estimated that about 1 out of 10 of all the Canadian forces in the theater of war are American citizens. There's also the vast majority of the Canadian forces are British born. They're not Canadian born. So there's this wide discrepancy here as we talk about this British Army of 1917. It's a completely different animal than it was even in November 1916, July 1916.
Do you think that also has an impact on how we perceive it as a Scottish battle? Because I talked last week about sort of how Lewes slightly overshadowed the Scottish losses at Gallipoli, and the difference between Dundee and Edinburgh. Do you think we sort of see, for a different reason here, that Scottish cities, for example, are less affected because we've got English troops in these Scottish regiments, and where they're coming from is more spread out? It doesn't affect the Scottish communities quite as much. Do you think we see that?
I would say so, as an outsider looking in, as the one outsider on the chat looking in.
Well, that's why it's useful to have you.
I would say, yeah. I think that it's not limited to Scotland as well. I think that all of these regions, and not talking even about Britain, look at American examples. We like to talk about battles where it's a clear cut, or actions where it's a clear cut unit that we could say, these New Yorkers. Look at the Lost Battalion in the Argonne. A lot of those guys, the majority of those guys, are originally from the Lower East Side, New York City, greater New York City area, and it's a New York story. We want this to be a regional story that people from those areas can claim. When you get to the First World War, it's much harder because they're starting to mix within states in the U.S. and within the greater British area, what we call the United Kingdom. That's another good word for it. So it's really interesting that the famous stories I always see looking at military history tend to be strictly regional. We could talk about the Welsh Division at Mamay. We could talk about the Highland Division at Beaumont Hamel, Ulster Division on the first day of the Somme, north of Tiap Val. And people from those areas really cling on to that. It's much harder to say this battalion advanced, and some of them were from Manchester, and some of them were from Inverness, and some of them were from Devon, and some of them were from Dublin. And that's why it's also hard for people to talk about the amount of, let's say, Scots in the Royal Artillery or the Royal Navy. It's not a clear-cut Scottish story.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case, because most of the battles that are widely remembered are at the start of the war, when you got the 1914, the regular army, and then the territorials, and then you move at 1915, you've got the new armies, and then 1916, where at the Somme, when the new army is bloodied and suffers greatly. But after 1916, you move into conscripts, and then this unit cohesion and identity is naturally watered down. They wear the same uniform, but they come from really diverse backgrounds, as opposed to like this tight geographical area that Jim was talking about. That's by 1917, that is pretty much gone.
I also think it's really important to note, and we'll probably mention this a lot for every episode, if we look particularly at Scotland, the memorialization of not only Arras, but the First World War. It's always this kilted Highland soldier.
Yeah.
There's bagpipes playing in the back. And that wasn't the experience for the majority of Scots. But again, it's that geographic, regional, this is what it was for us.
Yeah, so if you look at the 9th Scottish Division, the majority of them are Lowlanders, wearing an almost identical uniform to any other unit. They're not overtly Scottish. It's only when you get close up and you see the insignia, but that's the identity is the Scottish soldiers always associated with the kilted Highlander. And the Eden kilted Highlanders, it's a bit of a misconception as well, because my great uncle Charlie, he was from Newton Grange, and he was in the 3rd Seaforth Highlanders. He was a 1918 conscript. So it's like he's hundreds of miles away from the recruiting area of the Seaforth Highlanders, and it's like, people say, if I was in the Seaforth Highlanders, he's sent there, basically. That's it. He's a conscript. Yeah.
It's certainly fascinating when you're looking in the medal roll index cards for individual men, and you'll see that they might have been enlisted in one regiment and then transferred to I was looking at a chap a couple of days back who started off in the Royal Scots and was then sent to the Northamptonshire Regiment. And it's this idea of men are being sent more or less where they're needed by that point, sort of thing. So Yeah, and it can be quite difficult to track people down, later on. And obviously, you'll know this yourself, chaps, when you're doing sort of research and family history and things like that, and people will say, well, my uncle was, at the Battle of Arras, and he was from, let's say, Edinburgh, and then you come back to him and say, well, yeah, he was in the Devonshire Regiment. So, and they're like, oh, he can't be because he's from Scotland. You're like, yeah. Oh, he can. He very definitely can.
That's it. Look at anywhere you are in the world. If your country fought in the First World War, whether it be in Scotland, in the greater UK, in the United States, in Canada, look at your local newspapers for the casualty rolls.
Yeah.
Because that's how you're going to find out where the men and women from your area served. There's a great online database that the Scottish Military Research Group has of the Glasgow Evening Times rolls.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're talking about guys in the Rifle Brigade, in the Middlesex Regiment, in the Indian Army serving as officers, in Merchant Marine. So it's a wide distribution.
Yeah, when I was doing the majority of my research, I used the microfilm archives at the Midlothian Library. And they had all the copies of the Midlothian advertising on microfilm. And I spent countless days and evenings there.
Tens of thousands of pounds or so.
Fortunately, they're very kind. They let me use my camera to take pictures.
That's not too bad. Yeah.
But Arras, though, it's bucked the trend for casualties. I can take Midlothian an example. What's called the blackest day of the war was Lewes. There was 42 men from the county killed on that day.
Yeah.
If you then go to the Somme the following year, there's 17 men from Midlothian killed. And if you then go to Arras, there's 32. So there is still a very strong Scottish contingent there, and the Lowland units. Jim has mentioned Manchester recruits 15th Royal Scots. Probably about 1 in 4 of them were from Manchester or Salford area, because I've got a roll book from the 15th Royal Scots, a company roll book, a copy of it, and you see the addresses Salford, Manchester, then you get the religion M Methodist, which is pretty common.
It's exactly like the sort of thumb, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's certainly very interesting what you're saying there, John, though, because just from the research that I'm doing at the moment into sort of like my school's rolls of honour, our big first rash of casualties is Gallipoli. There's an unpleasantly heavy yet steady trickle through the Somme, but then a huge spike at the Battle of Arras because of the school's involvement in the 9th Royal Scots. And, we have John and George Campbell, who are two brothers who were killed next to each other on, the same Lewis gun team, who were buried next to each other. Two Stuartonian platoon commanders, one of whom is killed, Hamish Adams. Percy Ferguson takes over from him, is killed. Their company commander is from Daniel Stewart's college as well, sort of thing. So you still do see like these big, like localizations of things even still. So to sort of move it on then, why has Arras been largely forgotten in Scotland? Because and just as a whole, I always like to sort of like play devil's advocate as we're closing up here. Has Arras been forgotten because it was a qualified success? Sort of like out there in sort of like the world of the like what you might call sort of man in the street, woman in the street perception of the First World War. Do we like success, or are we much happier to restate these? Oh, it was all slaughter. It was all slaughter. It was purposeless. What? It doesn't seem to fit in. As we said, we've had sort of break-ins. We've almost had cavalry being used here. There's more progress made in some days in this battle than has been at more or less any point during the last 18 months, sort of thing. Why don't we remember Arras? Why don't we remember Arras? And why isn't there perception of this, that this was actually, pretty successful, in spite of the terrible casualties? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting that the Vimy Ridge action is the one we remember, because that is, of course, is the nation-building moment for Canada.
Yeah.
But I think you're somewhat right there in that it doesn't fit the model of how many people want to remember the First World War. Obviously, Arras is a horrible, bloody battle that lasts for weeks, if not months, but it doesn't fit that role of it was stalemate. The British Army is making clear gains, albeit at a cost. During that time, they're employing tactics that they had perfected and put the final notes on over the course of 1916 into 1917. They're applying the lessons learned from the Battle of the Somme. And so I think it's a really different sort of remembrance in that people don't know how to talk about it, because it's a victory with heavy casualties. And I think that the problem you have as well is that it is overshadowed by three big events. First off, you have the Canadian storming Vimy Ridge, which is part of the battle of itself. That's going to take a lot of attention. 3 days before the start of the battle, the United States enters the war, which is going to take up a lot of newspaper headlines. And then as well, you have the fact that it's going to sort of fizzle out and give the British Army sort of this impetus for the rest of 1917, which, again, the actions around Ypres and Flanders are also going to overshadow the fighting at Arras. So I think just because it's surrounded by all of these big events, the rest of the fighting doesn't get the attention that it necessarily deserves.
And I think as well, this is exactly what Rome was showing before. It's bloody complicated, isn't it? You know, like where the British Army is at in its sort of development, and there is, as you were saying before, Jim, not a some sort of bag that you can put this into, sort of thing. Yeah, Ronnie, you got?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with Jim. It's not a historical reason really why Arras is not remembered so well. I think it's a historiographical one, and I've written quite a lot on this, really. You know, it's like Loos was really bad. The Somme was even worse. Arras, Ypres was really bad. You know, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with the Scottish kind of narrative of, you know, what happened to us, and because the tactics change, it's complex. It's almost a polar opposite in terms of tactics, leadership. You know, how it's actually conducted from the Somme. It's quite difficult to have a coherent argument about the Somme, really, and then go into talking about Arras and talk about the same things. You know, so for, you know, someone who's just doing sort of passing, looking into it, not doing a huge amount of research, it is actually a really complicated thing to kind of get your head around.
Yeah, I think, like you say, but it doesn't fit any sort of typical mould, if you like. You've got street fighting, you've got fighting through villages, you've even got caves and routes. There's a whole cave system in there, and so you've got the Highland Division pouring in and taking the objective, and then they're finding the Germans popping up behind them and shooting them from like 3 directions, basically. And urban warfare and sort of like and rural warfare and trench warfare and everything, it's got a mix in it. It just doesn't fit into a pigeonhole at all.
It was snowing. It was meant to be raining, but it was snowing.
Yeah.
Whoa, no, we can't. Whoa, no, we don't do snow. We can't have snow. It's like the snow at Gallipoli. We can't have snow at Gallipoli.
I think as well, one like final point that I'll make before I'll shut up is that people tend to have not very long attention spans when it comes to some of these First World War battles. Look at the Somme. People hyper focus on the first day, right?
That's it.
Why does no one ever talk about Longueval?
People hyper focus on just the day of the landing, April 25th at Gallipoli, right? So if you look just at April 9th, that first day of Arras, it's a big success, right? They are breaking through the German lines in many, many places. So if you just look at that and then say, well, I'm not going to pay attention to the actions around Fampoux, I'm not going to pay attention to the actions around the chemical works, or Greenland Hill, that's where the, you know, I still don't think today we as historians, although there's been some amazing new work, really understand the Battle of Arras.
Yeah, I was just going to add as well, kind of just, it was something I was going to add earlier when we were talking about the kind of Scottishness of the battle, is that it's not like the battles that we've seen before in other ways. Like, for example, someone mentioned about going over the top with pipes playing and stuff. Although they bring them back later, at the time of Arras, it's really the time that they've almost completely abandoned that.
That's not good for your health.
Sometimes you would see a Scottish battalion going into action, they wouldn't even look Scottish or Highland. Like the 6th Black Watch actually got issued trousers when it started snowing.
Yeah.
They didn't give them braces and they shot them because they kept falling down, but that's not the point.
That's exactly what John was saying.
Things changing, evolving. It's not the traditional idea of what the battle's going to be like, I think.
So exactly what John was saying. If you look at a Lowland Scottish regiment and they've got tin lids on, could be from anywhere, sort of thing.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Good point. John,
you see at Arras as well. I call it a quantum leap in artillery and how it moved on. It laid the foundations for 1918 probably. Massively complicated. Barrages. I've seen some of the maps and it's utterly bewildering.
The maps are incredible, aren't they? Yeah, when you look at the fire missions that the Royal Artillery were putting down, it's bonkers.
Even like tactics, but I thought 9 divisions started. They were dropping gas, but they mixed in smoke with it as well. So the Germans would smell gas, don their gas mask, but there wasn't enough gas there to actually do anything seriously wrong to you. So the Scots moving up behind but wouldn't have their gas masks on. So it gave them a tactical edge. The vision is better because they've been told that this is it's smoke mostly, but the Germans think it's gas because there's subtle mix and things like that. It's just quite clever tactics, really. That was part of the problem with that they ran out of the clever artillery. After
that's it. You may be an over-reliance on firepower, and sort of like the movement and maneuver aspect sort of maybe drops away a little bit.
So artillery are really professional, unit, high degree of skill. When you overrun, when you get past your artillery, you're then relying on your firepower within your unit. And as we've already talked about, the marksmanship has dropped. So you go to this umbrella, if you like, a cover, and that's it.
And
ultimately it comes down to the right
people not looking after you now.
No.
That's it. All right then, chaps. Just to draw this to a close. For many years, there wasn't really anything really available on the Battle of Arras. Obviously, there was a Cheerful Sacrifice, which came out I think it was 1991 or something like that. But there's obviously been quite a good deal written on Arras since then, and quite a lot relatively recently. So essentially, what do you recommend? There's a lot of people, I'll be perfectly honest, my day-to-day existence is largely predicated around looking forward to parcels arriving from Amazon. So what would you recommend? If people want to take this further, where should they go? What should they read? What's the most up-to-date stuff? What can you recommend?
Well,
there we go. Cheerful Sacrifice, absolutely classic. Yeah.
It's still good. Yeah, it's still worth buying. And Bill Hay, who you mentioned, he features in it.
I was going to say Bill Hay, extensively quoted there. Wonderful.
I would also recommend this by Jim Smithson, Taste of Success. James already mentioned him. He's excellent. It's really thorough, really in depth, and it's a new publication only out last year. I would thoroughly recommend it. And if you're walking the battlefield, I would still recommend the Battlefield Guide by Paul Reed.
I used that while I was out there last year.
Yeah, it's a nice size. It can stick in a pocket. And
that took me over Greenland Hill.
So that's 3 I would certainly recommend it. And you can pick some of them. Like the walking guides, you can pick these up probably quite cheap in eBay, and there's always a lot of them up for sale. There's 2 or 3 on Arras, but that's an all-encompassing one. That's probably the best one to have, really.
Anything else, gents? You want to jump in there? Want to add anything to what we've seen there? Or?
Yeah, I would, since John's covered really the best recently written books, I'll do a few personal accounts. Predominantly, if you read With the 9th Scottish Division, which is the history of the 9th Division, they have a really good section on their action at Arras, especially as it pertains to what we talked about today. Then there's A Passionate Prodigality. Guy Chapman's recollection, which is not a Scottish, but it's a really good. He was with the 10th Royal Fusiliers, and he comments really heavily on the actions around Monchy. That's also a very good one. There's some really good recent studies of the Canadian Corps, which including Stay Tough, which focuses on the actions around Vimy Ridge. And finally, Friends Are Good on the Day of Battle, which is a history now of a newer history of the 51st Highland Division. So.
Oh, lovely! Yeah. Another thing that just springs to mind is the new book on the 9th Royal Scots, Mr. Gilhooly's new book on you know, if you're looking for a specific unit history there, delightful. The illustrations are brilliant. The maps are delightful. Wonderful mixture of personal history, which gives you a really good overview of what one particular Scottish battalion was doing that day. Anything else?
I'd just like to mention.
Go for it, mate. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to mention one, which is actually a book. It's been about for about 30 years, I think, but it's kind of quite.
Oh, Paddy Griffiths. There you go.
Paddy Griffiths, Battle Tactics of the Western Front.
Wonderful.
Basically explains a lot of what I've been saying. You really need to have access to the manuals to sort of understand it better, I think. But yeah, it's just quite an underestimated book now, and it explains a lot about what was going on at Arras and in the open warfare of 1918.
Yeah. Paddy Griffith has been the basis of all modern historiography when it comes to the British learning curve. So definitely, if you don't own that book.
But it's the kind of book that gets kind of overlooked, I think, by the kind of person dipping into the First World War, where it would really help understand things like that.
Because that's the whole thing. It's like, battle tactics. Am I really into that as a general reader? I remember reading this for the first time, maybe sort of 15, maybe more years ago, and actually, it's one of those books where you can actually feel your mind expand. Like, right, I get it now. Like, so, right. So yeah, absolutely wonderful. Yeah, and a really nice link in there. As you were saying, with this new sort of sort of like evolved command, rapid decision making, initiative being placed on small squads of men. It's interesting from my point of view, doing the research at the school that I work at the moment. 1917, in terms of the gallantry medals that are awarded, because it's essentially just like, we can let a sergeant do that. That's fine. So like in terms of the MMs, the DCMs, and an incredible amount of military crosses which are being dished out to second lieutenants that are 18, 19, 20, 21 that are really running the battles, taking the fight forward, and winning by this point. Yeah,
if I could maybe just finish on books. I can't find it just now, but it's a book by Bill Marwick, who's in the 4th South African Infantry. It's a personal account by him, and it includes the fighting around Fonku, and it's quite a personal view of a soldier's eye view of the battle. It's a good read. He describes the utter carnage suffered by the South Africans in that day. He got back and he was lightly wounded, and a double rum ration came up with the company men. It's 170 men it was supposed to be this ration for. There's 14 of them left. And that was effectively that was the end of the fighting for the South Africans in 1917. They spent the rest of 1917 just reforming, and then eventually in 1918 they were wiped out almost completely after that.
Yeah, it seems to be a common thread for those lads. Yeah, pyramids and poppies covers some of that stuff as well.
And certainly they described the fighting at Fonku as the worst of the war, far worse than Delville Wood. So that puts it into perspective how
That's
bad it
saying
was.
something, isn't it? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's absolutely, that is, yeah, really saying something. Crikey. All right then, chaps. Any last points, or shall we draw it together for our studies this week? Or?
No, I think just to say that hopefully we'll be live again as compared
Yeah,
to.
you never know your luck. You never know your luck.
But if anybody has any particular interest in regards to Scotland or the First World War, definitely let us know. And it could be really any topic as long as it pertains to those two key themes. So
yeah, that's the whole thing. You know, we'd love to throw it out there. If you've got some ideas yourself, chuck it out there. And of course, if you have any personal stories, family recollections, anything like that, you know, please share away. We're, you know, more than happy to learn from folk. Yeah. All right then. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll put the links to the books that we've been talking about on the page later on. And we'll have a little think. Hopefully, we'll get some ideas from the floor from you chaps and the chapettes out there. And we'll see you back this time next week. Thank you very much. Take care.
talk to you later.